Well, hello. I do apologize that it's been so long since my last video to you on Hume. And sadly, I'm going to kind of make up for it by speaking a fair bit in this one. Although, inevitably there'll be more notes, there'll be a follow up video. Don't panic if there seems a great deal of material here that's suddenly a bit overwhelming. All right, let us return to where we last left our hero in this saga. So, you have in the background this argument Hume has about reason and passion. We've said something about that. And the point that he thinks is most important for him in what follows is that intentional action, like any other event that has a cause, has a certain kind of, causal state as its origin. And that for you must mean that motivation, like the flexing of a muscle, must be understood as a state without any intrinsic representational content. And you takes that claim to imply that moral predicates, moral distinctions, moral properties, these terms don't always mean exactly the same thing, but in this class, they can. So, imagine all the moral concepts you have at your disposal: rude, kind, just, unfair, and so forth and so on. These are the moral distinctions. These are the attributions and the predicates that we apply in the moral domain. It is central to Hume's view that these predicates, these terms, these concepts cannot name facts either in the world. They're not facts in the world the way, naturalistic science does traffic in terms that name facts in the world, nor do they name the other sorts of facts that might be, such as abstract relations, the sort that, say, mathematical or logical facts might be said to be. Um, Hume is determined to show that moral terms cannot name facts. What they name instead are non cognitive states in us that we project onto the object that in some way or other elicits this response. It's a very seductive view. It's got a lot that philosophers love. Um, it certainly makes sense of why we might feel very strongly about a situation that we find to be unjust or kind and so forth. Um, and it certainly explains why we are, when in the grip of these judgments, motivated sometimes to act one way or another. And here's a real benefit: it doesn't offend the scientist. You don't have any weird entities. Some of you may, I assume, if we're abiding by these requirements and you've had some philosophy in the past and you read, say, some Plato who spoke about something like the good as this super sensible entity that existed out there, not in the natural world, but in some sort of world of forms or ideas. This is the sort of stuff that gives physicists headaches. This is just nuts. It can't be right. Nothing in Hume in any way bothers the naturalistic scientist. To the contrary, Hume assimilates moral life to, a range of essentially, I can use this word because it's largely true. There are some variations, but we can say largely biological reactions. Not always. Our judgments regarding justice, you'll see when we take up utilitarianism, we'll read a bit of Hume in this way. He thinks these are, in some sense, constructed. We had to learn how to have regard for respect for property, because property itself is a kind of construction that helps us out of the limitations of our circumstances. But on the whole, for Hume, morality is rooted in this deeply natural, creaturely like reaction to things. certain examples, again, I haven't even gotten to the argument yet, but the kind of solicitousness that we might feel for young children and the tremendous protectiveness we feel towards our own children. Well, Hume would say this is just rooted in how we're made. It's not like there's some fact in the world that we detect that explains these features of ourselves. When we're constructed to feel certain kinds of empathy for other creatures more or less like us, and this is just something that happens to be true of us, or happens to be true of some of us and not all. When you're in certain parts of the world, you might see somebody treat animals in a way that strikes you as very unkind and vicious. Somebody strikes that donkey and you have this inner reaction of just disgust or revulsion. This is pure Hume. Absolutely pure Hume. You're just made to have this reaction to something that could be described in a way that makes no reference whatsoever to that reaction. All right, these are just sort of tantalizing hints of where the theory is plausible or appealing. The naturalism is very important. Hume gives an account of morality that fits smoothly with the natural sciences. He's also been very lucky in, well, I mean, it was a real insight, but Hume does not himself write with any knowledge of the theory of evolution. He writes roughly about 80 years, let's say close to 100 years before Darwin. But the Darwinian theory is very kind to the Humean point of view, that, there might be a kind of purely naturalistic story in virtue of which we've developed certain sorts of tendencies and dispositions and habits, in virtue of which we have the moral responses that we have. I mean, this is a very congenial development for Hume, the theory of evolution that Darwin is to propose 80 years later. It's one of the reasons why Hume sticks around, because his view is so congruent with what you would want to say as a Darwinian. All right, but we'll return to this when we have all of Hume before us, and we can kind of take the big picture. What's strong, what's weak, where does he have something right, where is he limited or incomplete? Okay, that's the view, that moral properties name distinct inner states caused by the world. They don't name facts, either empirical facts or abstract relations. What's the argument? Well, amazingly, Hume was a very young man when he wrote the treatise. It's almost impossible for me to say how young he was. He's something like 26 or 27 when he writes the treatise. And there's a certain flippancy and easygoing casualness. He went on to write many other works and refine his position to greater degrees, but there's something very unforced and fresh about the arguments in the treatise that he never exceeded. And as intriguing and complex as his position is, the arguments for it that you read, they're brief, and they're only three. And here they are. There's this motivation argument, which I've sent you an email on, and I said a little bit about before. And, I got to tell you, the more I teach this, the more I just kind of think, surely, with a little time, Hume would have seen this is a terrible argument. You can't possibly show anything about the status of what it is you're motivated by rehearsing some account of what you think motivation is. I suppose for me, the clearest example is, I could be motivated to avoid carcinogenic substances like, asbestos. Now, that motivational state is some non-cognitive state that pushes me away from the asbestos building. Fine. But the predicate is carcinogenic or is asbestos. That's a fact predicate that could be detected by reason. Obviously, the Martian who doesn't care can detect that this is asbestos or this is carcinogenic, may not care, but that's not what the argument is supposed to show. The argument isn't supposed to be when you care about morality, you're in a non-cognitive state. We've already shown that, allegedly. I mean, I don't think the argument is right, but you can't show anything about the thing you care about by talking about the caring. You could care about it being carcinogenic. You could care about it being beautiful to you. It's not quite the Humean idea, the beautiful to you, since Hume traffics in properties he thinks are more or less rooted in biological facts about ourselves, so they don't vary enormously across persons. But be that as it may, I hope you see the main point. Somebody could be motivated by beauty, maybe even if we take the predicate is beautiful to name a sort of stable predicate for persons. So, as I suppose was the case in an earlier time to some degree, there might just be widespread agreement that seeing the moon rise over the pyramids is beautiful, and seeing the Grand Canyon is beautiful, or seeing, the Amazon River is beautiful, and so forth and so on. There might be widespread agreement about what sorts of things elicit this inner state. Big deal. That's one kind of thing I could be motivated by. And then being motivated to, buy anything and everything that costs $10,000 would be a very different motivation. The motivational state in both cases would be a non-cognitive muscle pushing me into the antique dealer and pushing me into the travel agent. Sure, but obviously one is a factual predicate and one is not. So again, you can't really show what Hume wants to show, which is that moral predicates fail to name factual states of affairs by pointing out that being motivated by them is to be in a non-cognitive state. All right, so I'm going to set the motivational argument aside. And I should say, my criticism of this argument assumes what I don't for a moment think is true, that Hume is right about motivation. I don't think it's right. I don't think our motivation is utterly devoid of representational content. But even if he were right about this, and it was, you don't show anything about the status of what you're motivated towards. Okay, now we get to really interesting, kooky arguments. He feels he can show that moral predicates must name non-cognitive inner states because they cannot name any kind of fact. And because there are two kinds of facts, he's got two arguments for each kind. There are abstract relations and empirical facts. The abstract relation argument is that weird argument. I sometimes call it the true of nature 2 argument about the acorn and the oak tree. I'll go into it in a moment. And the other argument, the one that I think is the most philosophically content-laden, is the willful murder is vicious argument. And that willful murder is vicious argument is supposed to show that the viciousness can't be thought of as a fact in the world that you detect. Okay, so facts come in two kinds. There are abstract relations, so it's a fact that 2 is a prime number. It's a fact that, a triangle is a three-sided figure, but these are abstract, not empirical facts. And of course, there are facts in the world that are contingent empirical facts, and you must show moral terms can't be either of those. Now, the abstract relation idea is so strange. It's kind of hard to know who Hume could possibly be arguing against, that something like justice might name some abstract relation. It's a weird idea. But Hume is making an interesting point that we'll actually have reason to draw upon when we take up Sartre and perhaps some others as well. And that is this: if your construal of moral concepts is too abstract, or if it's sufficiently abstract, you're going to have the embarrassing consequence that it will be true of objects that we would never in a million years think could actually bear moral properties. And this, I think, is a genuine insight. So I'm just going to rehearse briefly that sort of acorn and oak tree. So, he says, obviously, parricide, killing a parent, or let's just, to make it easy, the son growing up and killing the father. Terrible, terrible, terrible. Nothing, I forget the exact language, but it's typically Hume, typically colorful. Nothing makes the soul, cringe and revulsion to a greater degree than the contemplation of parricide, of all the crimes that occur in humanity. Surely none is darker, and on and on. You can write the rest yourself or read it. And yet, he says, if it's simply a relation, if we give a sufficiently abstract description that there's some offspring which is dependent for its existence upon the, let's just use the word in the most generic sense, parent, and the offspring upon reaching maturity causes the parent's death. If some acorn that is dropped by an oak tree takes root, grows up, and o'ertops, to use Hume's word, the oak tree, causing the oak tree itself to be destroyed, there's no moral wrongness here. Another interesting example is, and he doesn't discuss it, I don't know if we will, I don't think there's really ever been any good discussion of this. He says, consider incest in animals. Doesn't bother us. If, the siblings of dogs and cats have sexual intimacy, doesn't bother us at all. It's the same relation. Can't be the relation. It's an interesting point. And if you take the relation, there it really is hardly, as in the oak tree and acorn example, the case that we have to ascend to a fairly abstract level of description to have what humans do with intentional states, an example of the same general kind of what an acorn is doing when it overpowers an oak tree. I mean, there are just so many other things going on in the case with persons, like the formation of intentions and knowing that, the father has, a right to live as a person and is also the appropriate object of respect and reverence as one's parent. There are just all these states in the actor that can't possibly be attributed to the acorn. But the incest in animals example is a good one, since it really is pretty much the same thing, and yet it elicits a kind of moral condemnation when persons do it, and it fails to excite much moral interest at all when animals do. And he says, don't say it lies in the mind and knowing, because if the wrongness is in the relation, it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter. If the relation is the bearer of the rightness or wrongness, then we should find ourselves making moral judgments of all kinds of things that stand in the same relation that you are claiming is the relevant feature in what is driving the moral judgment with persons. I think there's an abstract version of Hume's point that could be put like this, and that I think is fairly right. Any relation R, if we just understand the relation, could be between any one of a number of very different kinds of entities. I mean, think about something like to the right of, to the left of, larger than, smaller than. These relations exist between my hands and the planets and the trees and the bushes of Bushwick Park. And, relation talk, just the relation, has got to be very easygoing about which objects are filling in the variables in any particular case. So if you really thought moral properties could be analyzed in terms of a relation, you'd be committed to the very embarrassing consequence that moral properties could be said to be true of, planets or, bushes and trees in the city parks or whatever. No relation will be sufficiently anchored to the distinctive nature of persons that it could possibly be the right candidate for understanding moral properties. Like I say, there's a version of Hume's point here that I think is worth bringing up again in other contexts, and I'd rather put it not in terms of relations, but just abstractness. If your analysis of moral goodness is too abstract, you may find yourself with the embarrassing consequence that it can equally well be applied to all kinds of very implausible candidates for moral assessment. Believe it or not, I'm going to say something like this is true of Sartre and how the existentialist understands moral goodness. It's such a very abstract understanding. It's a perfectly coherent consequence to think of moral goodness being attributable to things that we would normally, not normally, even on reflection, feel are just not candidates for moral assessment to begin with. All right, that's just a bit of a teaser for the next philosopher. Now we turn to the third argument, this willful murder is vicious argument. It's not really an argument. What it is an illustration of how Hume sees the world. It's what you might call a kind of, picturing of the theory rather than an argument for it. But it's a very powerful one. And it's, in fact, of all the arguments in that section, the one I like the best. So consider any judgment, you know, the consider the viciousness of the willful murder. Now, the word willful adds nothing. It just means intentional, and we wouldn't call it a murder if it wasn't intentional. If I come into my room, my apartment, and I flip the light switch, and unbeknownst to me, somebody has wired that switch to a bomb somewhere else, and so turning on the switch kills somebody. I haven't murdered anybody because I don't turn on the switch with any intention that this consequence happened. So I won't always add or include the word willful, but Hume uses it and it has a nice poetic aspect to it. So consider that willful murder. Now, consider all the facts and relations. The viciousness, he says, entirely escapes you until you turn your attention inside to your own breast. That's where it is. This is a marvelous thought experiment. And again, science fiction and the construction of rational aliens has been a great help to Hume here. So imagine a kind of, a Mr. Spock like figure, or pick your own alien, somebody standing next to you, or say at a performance of Macbeth. Let's take a fictional case where the facts are kind of completely known to us and completely constrained by the authorial construction. So, Macbeth murders Banquo, sneaks into his chamber and plunges the knife. What's Hume saying? Well, I can see the knife being raised. I can see the knife going in. I can see the blood flowing out. I can see all the facts. I can see all the facts. But the viciousness, where's that? That's no fact that I see. I mean, where's that fact? That's not a fact like the fact there were 7 stab wounds. Banquo lost, 3 pints of blood. His death was rather slow despite the intensity of the attack. All of these things are perfectly factual claims, but the claim this was vicious, Hume says, typical Humean move. But where's the viciousness? I don't see that. That's because it's in here, and I project it back onto what I see as if it's something I see. And this is a very powerful kind of wedge. Hume is saying, if you really think hard about what the facts are, you'll see this moral talk isn't included. It's not part of it. The facts don't include the moral predicates that are so important to us. And again, I gave the example, or well, it's more like the domain of aesthetic predication in nature. And here you can see the Humean argument very clearly as well. So when we look at that, sublime sunset, you can imagine what Hume would say. Consider the sunset and all its facts and relations, and the sublimity entirely escapes you. You can see how the argument will go. Well, that the sun is setting for so many minutes, that the wavelengths are causing certain shades of red and yellow for certain periods of time. I mean, the fact descriptions can get very precise, and they can really hone in on the object of our response. It's not just the sunset, but the way in which, this color gives rise to this shade, which gives rise to that for so many seconds, and then that, and then the wavelengths begin to make the sun look much larger. And lots of fact talk is out there for us to avail ourselves of. No dispute there. But when we turn to that predicate, it is sublime, it is beautiful. Now the Humean says, well, sure, but where is that sublimity? It's not a fact in the world. It's a response in you that you project back on to the object which caused it. All right, that's the view. And I think in that example, that very brief, there's a lot of talk, the motivation argument and the acorn and oak tree argument. But in the end, I think those 2 paragraphs about the willful murder of being vicious, that's the most powerful argument in the whole section. That's the real mountain to climb. And as because it's been so long since I've last spoken to you, and because, there's a certain amount of content here that I really want to kind of cover today, I'm going to also now dive into what is wrong with this argument of Hume's. And even though we start with Hume, because I think there's a great deal about this view of moral judgment that's very appealing and very intuitive, it's also the case that he makes it work by fudging in a fairly tricky, sophisticated way. And making this clear is going to be a bit of a challenge for us all. So here we begin. Okay. That willful murder is vicious. All right. I said, take a breath. And now we're going to discuss critically the nature of this example. The willful murder is vicious and what it seems to show and how it seems to work. We know what it seems to show. It seems to show that moral properties cannot name facts in the world, but rather responses that the world causes. But when we say responses that the world causes, I think there is no question that Hume is fudging in his account here of what the object of response, or I really want to say what the so-called object of response is in this case, as opposed to the cases that work so well for him. What cases work so well for him? The cases that really work well for him are the cases where it is a straightforward empirical causation story. The lemon is sour. Perhaps even the starry skies are beautiful, where there's this thing that nature generates. We encounter it and find ourselves having a certain kind of caused reaction or response. But to call this object of response a willful murder is in fact to traffic in a concept that's not a natural kind concept. To call it a murder is a very heavy thing. It's not just a killing. After all, there are lots of killings that are not murders. It could be self-defense. It could be two soldiers shooting, one of whom killing the other in wartime. It could be a kind of, negligent homicide. In other words, the description A does X and X causes B's death. That's a factual description, maybe, but that's not yet murder. That description is consistent with, as I say, physician-assisted suicide, justified self-defense, combat death in wartime. Lots of cases. To call it murder isn't to say a killing, but an unjustified killing. In calling it murder, you're saying that the agent did not have a good reason. That's the category. It's the finding of just that the motivation wasn't justified. That's what the jury is, in fact, charged with determining. Think about it. Murder names to use a fancy word, but we might as well get used to it, murder already has a normative element, which is to say, having to do with a normative judgment, a judgment having to do with standards or the like. Finding this killing an act of murder is to say more than something happened causally. It's to say that what happened was not, in fact, justified. The agent who did it did not have a good justification. That's why we call it murder. It is a killing without a good justification. So we've in fact already packed in the moral determination into the account of the object that is allegedly the cause of the response. The lemon is just a natural object, and it causes a response. But this thing that I'm responding to here, in calling it a murder, I'm not naming some object in nature. I am, in fact, expressing a normative judgment about the nature of the killing to begin with. Now you might say, well, okay, maybe Hume was just careless. Maybe he should have combined the two and said, the willful murder is vicious, is a reaction to these facts that we can describe without a normative vocabulary. But for the reasons, I think Hume was very smart to try and smuggle the normativity into the appearance of naturalistic neutrality. Because if we're really forced to strip or bleach out all the normative content, then what we get is what I said before. A does X and X causes the death of B. And now you're going to have all kinds of different judgments attached to that extremely abstract neutral description. Homicide, suicide, negligent homicide, physician-assisted suicide, combat death, et cetera, et cetera. The description bleached of all normative content will be too far from any distinctive category as to warrant the judgment of willful murder versus something else. Then it becomes absolutely mysterious why we see it one way rather than another. And all this points to what I think you should be sensing from the start. Our finding this killing a willful murder isn't anything like finding the lemon sour. It's not a causation story elicited by a natural object. It's rather a normative judgment that draws upon conceptions of what is and isn't justified from the start. Hume is cheating by presenting as if it were an object in nature, what is in fact the result of a highly complex normative judgment. If you've called it a murder, of course you'll find it vicious, because in calling it a murder, you're calling it a killing that can't be justified. The viciousness follows semantically. It's not a causal relation. It follows from the very judgment that this is a murder rather than, say, self-defense. Hume cannot, in fact, present our judgments as responses to natural objects. Murder is no natural object, but a category applied, drawing upon all kinds of normative considerations, drawing on justification stories. If we think, and so unsurprisingly, not to make too big a point of this, you might find differences in judgment as to whether or not this was murder or justified self-defense or something else. And different cultures or different juries could reasonably, in close cases, find the very same factual description, bleached of normative content, murder or not murder. And that's an absolutely incoherent possibility on the Humean view. That would be like, my finding the lemon sour sometimes and not some other. In virtue of my biology, that's the reaction I'm going to have. And that's the point. It's a reaction. And that's how Hume wants to present moral judgment, as a reaction. but it isn't. It's a judgment. Judgments are not reactions. They have justification stories. We actually can say why we think it's a murder and not justified homicide or something like that, because we are going to draw upon a variety of considerations in making our characterization of the object. If Hume were right, that would be weird. It's not some characterization that I draw upon that causes me to have the sourness as a response to the lemon. That's a causation story. My tongue touches these substances, and certain kinds of taste buds are stimulated in a certain way. It's a pure causation story. But obviously, that causation story presumes stability in the object causing the consequent reaction. Fine. But in the moral case, the object is not a natural object, but it is, you might say, achieved through the reflective process of judgment. You know, whether or not this is a murder is something we determine through judgment. Very asymmetrical to the lemon. All right, I'm going to leave it at that. It's a lot of content. We'll go over this. I think there'll be one more kind of what Hume gets right, what he gets wrong. I'm going to try and send out some more notes. Please think about this and send me a question. It's been suggested that we try and do a Zoom meeting. Perhaps we can next week, next Wednesday, during our regular scheduled, business meeting time. Let me know what you think of this. Please send me some emails and weigh in. Suggest other days and times if you want. But let me set that aside for a moment. Eventually, we'll have some kind of Zoom, I'm sure. We're not that big a class. We can do it. Before we worry about the Zoom, think more about the Hume. Nice. I never did that before. And whether what I've said today makes sense to you, what it seems to show about Hume, and so forth and so on. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much. Bye.